Our first lesson this morning comes from the end of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, where Moses is allowed to see but not cross over into the promised land before he dies. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. May God add God's blessing to the hearing and the reading and the understanding of these words. If you would please stand if you are able for the gospel reading. We are continuing today in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, where Jesus continues to call disciples, heal, and eat with tax collectors and sinners. Here in verse 14, he is questioned about his behavior. Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." These are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So, how many of you like wine? It's 2020. All bets are off. I'm not gonna tell all of you out there in social media land how many people who are participating in the service this morning raised their hand when I asked that question. And I didn't even look to my right, where another pastor and Sean are sitting. Would you ever have believed that a pastor would start out a sermon, "How many of you like wine?" Before we get too upset and think, well, gosh, Nanette's really gone off the deep end because it's 2020 and it's just gotten to her, know that Jesus speaks of wine more than once through the course of the scriptures, and there are verses about wine in the Old and New Testament. Now, before we get too far with all of that, understand that Jesus uses wine as an illustration in a lot of different places. One of the first miracles, if not the first miracle that Jesus performs, as John's gospel witnesses to, is Jesus being at that wedding with his mother at Cana of Galilee, and the wine runs out, and it's very embarrassing for a family who is hosting the wedding banquet for wine to run out. Now understand, those banquets often went on for days, and so to provide enough wine for everyone would have been quite a task. And Jesus' mother does not want the family to be embarrassed, and so she goes to Jesus and she says, "You need to do something. The wine is running out." And Jesus tries to share with her that his time hasn't come, meaning that his life is not yet being required to be poured out. But he goes to the servant and he asks him to take him to where the wine casks are, and then he, as we know, turns water into wine, and there's lots of funny Facebook memes about that. But Jesus understands in his day and his time, perhaps not unlike ours, that wine was used for special occasions, as celebrations. When Jesus talks about inviting people to a banquet, he says to go out and collect people, the poor and those who otherwise wouldn't be invited anywhere, so that they might come in and eat and drink. And perhaps most particularly at that Last Supper, where he celebrates that Passover meal with his disciples, where they remember the power of God. And Jesus is about to establish a new covenant. He takes wine and blesses it. We use grape juice. It's probably not so much a matter of the substance as it is the meaning that we give to what Jesus does. So I want us to understand about wine. I want us to perk up our ears this morning. And if that did it, then I'm grateful, because I want us to understand that when Jesus uses the illustration he does this morning about new wine and old wineskins and new wine and new wineskins, that he was talking to a people who would have understood and would have received that with a kind of deeper knowledge than perhaps we are willing to give it credit. Jesus has been doing ministry, as Pastor Cheryl said before she read the gospel lesson. He's been doing ministries of healing and of freeing folks from demons, and he's called Matthew a tax collector, and he's gone with Matthew to eat with other sinners as well. And the Pharisees and those who have been interpreting the law, they're grumbling about how Jesus would eat with sinners. And Jesus says, I came to save not the righteous, but the sinners. And it illustrates for us a way of thinking that perhaps they can't get out of their own way to see anew. So after Jesus shares that with them, then they notice that Jesus and his disciples don't fast. And in that day and time, the knowledgeable religious would fast twice a week as part of their worship of God. It was sincere, it was authentic, it was an understanding that that's what you would do if you were a faithful follower of God. And the Pharisees not only notice that Jesus and his disciples aren't doing it, the disciples of John the Baptist notice it. Remember with me, and in a few weeks from now, we will hear again the story of John the Baptist. He's the one who prepared the way for Jesus' ministry. It was Elizabeth and John, who are Mary's cousins, who is the mother of Jesus, who give birth to John. John expected, as he said when he was out in the wilderness, John expected this Messiah to come with a winnowing fork. And to separate the wheat from the chaff, and to throw the chaff into the outer fire, and to take the wheat, and they would be the ones who would be saved. And so in a way, John is still understanding this particular way of goodness and badness, this particular way of being included and excluded, and who was right and who was wrong. And stuck in that mindset, they come to Jesus, and as Jesus does acts of mercy, they're trying to get their minds around how that fits, because it doesn't fit with right and wrong every single time. If it fit with right and wrong, Jesus would not have called a tax collector to be one of his first followers. He wouldn't have gone to the home of someone who is sinful and eaten with other sinners. He would be illustrating for his disciples and teaching them, as all rabbis would their disciples, that they should fast twice a week to follow that law of God. And so Jesus says, when they ask him why they aren't fasting, Jesus says that you don't mourn while the bridegroom is still with you. The time will come when the bridegroom is no longer here, and then there will be time to fast. And he knows they don't get that. He knows they don't understand it. And so he comes with two illustrations that he knows they will understand. They're more practical, they're more everyday, they're more common. Maybe they perked up their ears at the mention of wine, just like perhaps we do. First, he says, understand this, you never sew an unshrunk piece of cloth onto an old cloak. Because then when the new piece of cloth shrinks, it will just widen the tear in the old piece of material. Neither do you put new wine into old wineskins, because the old wineskin will burst, the wine will be spilled, and it all will be ruined. But you put new wine into new wineskins, and then it all is preserved. They would have understood that in a way perhaps that we don't. It would not have been shocking to them that a leader of a religious community would be talking about wine like maybe it shocks us a little bit, because I raise my hand. I like certain kinds of wine. And please understand, while we may chuckle about that a little bit, I know the negative aspects of wine for those who have the disease of alcoholism and the destruction it can bring on a family. And I know that when we use wine as a numbing agent, that's not what we're talking about. Jesus is talking about when a bit of wine is received at a banquet of celebration and joy, of meaningful moments. And so he's saying to people, this is a valuable commodity that we use for meaningful moments. And what he's trying to illustrate is that we can't open ourselves to the possibility of what the future God has in store for us if we continue thinking in our old ways. If we are that old cloak, you can't sew new unshrunk material on that old cloak without the old cloth tearing even more. Maybe seamstresses understand that, but I think it's more universal for us to understand that you can't put new wine into old wineskins, because this is what happens. Old wineskins have already stretched and used their flexibility to receive the wine they already have. New wine has to ferment. And fermenting puts off gases, and gases causes the liquid to expand. It causes the container to expand. And without flexibility, an old wineskin would simply burst. But a new wineskin still has that flexibility. Jesus is trying to say to these folks who don't yet understand that he's going to give up his life for them, who don't yet understand why it is that they're not following every jot and tittle of the law. He's not saying that the law isn't worth anything. He's not saying that everything that has gone before should be condemned and not preserved. In fact, what he says with this illustration of the wine is that if you'll put new wine into new wineskins, all of it will be preserved. The old wineskins as well as the new. I will tell you that on more than one occasion, I've said that I wish we could go back. I wish we could go back to the day before we knew about the coronavirus. I call it COVID 18+1 because I refuse to say the number. It's my little game to say I control it, because I control what I call it. I want to go back to the day before that we knew it was a global pandemic. I want to go back to the day before we knew how easily it was transferred from one person to another. I want to go back to the day before we realized we had to wear masks, that we realized we had to stay distant, that we realized we had to shelter at home. Pastor Cheryl did a funeral this week, and I was greeting the Lois Heath's daughter before the service, and we both wanted to hug. Because Lois was a church woman to the marrow of her bones. She loved her church and her church loved her, and we couldn't share that nonverbal sign of knowing. I want to go back to the day before that. Jesus is asking me this morning, Nanette, what do you miss? What do you miss that I am blessing in the future by wanting only to go back, by mourning what you don't have right now, and the vision I may very well have for a future that you have not allowed yourself to see yet? That's what he's saying to the disciples of John the Baptist. That's what he's saying to the Pharisees. You can't get out of your own way to see the possibility of what God's bringing about with the living word that is showing you a new way. And that new way has to do with those who are called sinners. That new way has to do with those who've never been invited before to a banquet to have the finest wine. You see, they served the finest wine first because the most important people came to the wedding banquet first. And on the second or third or fourth day, that's when the poor people came to celebrate that wedding. And so the families didn't worry. Whatever they had left, the cheaper wine. And what Jesus does when he performs that miracle, the servant immediately says, this wine is better than any we've had from the beginning. And Jesus is asking the Pharisees and the followers of John the Baptist, are you going to be inflexible like that old wineskin? it's okay if you are. You will be preserved as well, as the illustration tells us. But the new wine is going into wineskins that are flexible enough to see a new way, a new possibility, to dream a new dream. Moses is standing at the top of Mount Pisgah this morning. Moses has been on this 40-year journey. Moses is standing with God. God has brought Moses again to the top of a mountain. Side by side, God says, this is the land of promise, the land that I said I would give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can see it, but you can't go over. What? Wait a minute, what? That's not the way it's supposed to work. Moses was the one who tried to convince God that he couldn't confront Pharaoh and set the people free, who had been enslaved by these pharaohs for 400 years. Moses gives God 5 excellent excuses, and God finds an answer to each and every one. And so Moses finally says, yes, Moses goes and confronts Pharaoh at the risk of his own life. And then he leads these people through this wilderness journey, and partway in, these same people that were crying for freedom were saying, take us back. This isn't what we thought it was going to be. The food is terrible. And God, through Moses, provides them manna and doves. This is the same Moses who at the top of Nebo earlier, when God is giving the covenant. The covenant that God has with God's people, we know as the 10 Commandments. And God looks down and sees that the people in Moses' absence have decided to make themselves their own God. They formed a golden calf, and this Moses goes toe to toe with God and convinces God to change God's mind and not to destroy the people. This is the same Moses who now is being told, you get to see the goal that I have relied on you to bring these people to. But you don't get to cross over. Maybe Moses is where the Pharisees and the followers of John the Baptist are this morning. Maybe God knows that Moses, the same skills that allowed Moses to go toe-to-toe and confront God, that allowed Moses to stand strong in front of this stubborn and stiff-necked people, the same Moses that was able to have the courage to face a Pharaoh, that same skill set is not the skill set that will allow them to envision a new future. A future that's not overshadowed by the slavery and the oppression of the past. And it's not that God doesn't love Moses. In fact, in the 10th verse of Deuteronomy, this last chapter of Deuteronomy, it says there has never been another leader like Moses that the Lord knew face to face. It's not a devaluing of Moses. It's simply saying that in this moment, Moses may not have the flexibility or the vision, and Joshua is given that blessing. Now that scripture is kind of complex because it says that because Moses struck a rock with his stick at Meribah, rather than getting water simply by asking God to bless the rock, that God is punishing Moses for that. But I'm not sure how that makes sense given everything that Moses does and what it says that Moses can see. So it says in those first 3 verses that Moses can see the land from Gilead to Dan to Naphtali, all of Ephraim and Manasseh, all of the region of Judah to the western sea, to the plains, to Jericho, the city of palms, and all the way to Zoar. Now, literally speaking, there is no single point at the top of Mount Nebo or any other mountain where a human being could see all of that land. And that, in fact, we find that Moses dies. And in the Midrash, which is the teachings and the interpretation of revered rabbis, one of the interpretations is that Moses was already with God's Spirit when God shows Moses this gift. That's, in fact, the kind of relationship Moses has with God. That's the future. Can we have gratitude for that future? Could Moses have gratitude for that future where he wasn't the one to cross the finish line, but my goodness, the gift of the blessing of what he saw? Because of the relationship he'd had with God for the 40 years plus previous to that. Can we be grateful for a future we can't yet quite imagine in the midst of the struggle of our present? Can we allow God to bring us possibility out of this struggle? Or have we already decided that if we can't go back to the way it was, we're not sure what's ahead is really much worth it? As I said, Jesus has, just previous to this piece of scripture, he's been with these disciples. He's not fasting. He's eating with sinners. And then immediately following this particular scripture, he's approached by a synagogue leader whose daughter is dying. And on the way to heal her, a woman with a hemorrhage who would have been considered so disabled, so unclean, that to touch him would have caused him to have to go through this ritual of cleanliness for 7 to 14 days. And not only is she allowed to touch the hem of his cloak, he calls her daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. And then he goes on to the synagogue leader's house, and those who are there say, we don't need you anymore. She's already dead. And Jesus says, no, she's just asleep. And they laugh at him. And he goes in the house and he lifts her up. And then there are two blind men who are yelling at him as he walks further on. They yell at him, have mercy on us, son of David, have mercy on us. And Jesus stops for them and he turns and he says, do you believe you can be made well? And they said, yes. And he said, you are made well because of your faith. And then he is approached by a person who is mute and believed to be filled with demons. And he releases those demons. And these same detractors say, only the Lord of demons can release demons. Old wineskins who have reached the capacity of their flexibility. Old cloaks who are so already pre-shrunk cannot handle a new patch. Where do we find ourselves? It's a legitimate decision to decide that we wish that we could go back to the day before the virus. We wish we could go back to the day before the mask mandate. We wish we could go back to the day before social distance. I will tell you, I've heard that most of my ministry and felt it in the depths of my heart when someone says, I wish I could go back to the day before the diagnosis of cancer. I wish I could go back to the day before the diagnosis of ALS. I wish I could go back to the day before the diagnosis of Parkinson's, because before that, everything was different. And once I heard that, then it filled every other thing that we ever did. It put shade on every other moment. It defined how it was we thought about every other thing. And we can decide that all of that is not valuable or there's not a blessing in any of that. And yet what Jesus is saying is what if you don't decide that? I can decide, because the holidays aren't going to be the same as I'm used to them always being, that they're going to be horrible holidays. And what will I miss by being an old cloak that is unable to receive a new patch? I can decide that because I really never wanted to do services on social media, that I never wanted to be on film, that I never wanted to be broadcast. I can decide that therefore it's not a good and blessed thing. And what do I miss? What do I miss in the exponential expansion of our reach? What do I miss by not wanting to receive new wine in a new wineskin? can we be grateful for a different future this year? Can we approach Thanksgiving with hearts of gratitude, not that someday we'll get to go back, but can we approach Thanksgiving and the Christmas holiday with the possibility of what it means to move forward, of what new things God has in store for us, of the blessings we have as a possibility to share anew with more people that we otherwise might never have met. So if wine is not something that's destructive for you or your family, if it's not something that is used to numb or anesthetize pain, if wine's something you use to celebrate, then I'm gonna do something I'll bet you've never heard a pastor do before. I'm going to challenge you to have a bit of wine with dinner tonight. And if it's not wine, take that other beverage that is special for you and your family. And as you sit down and share dinner together, and so that's my other prescription, I want you to sit down and have dinner together. And I want you to take a deep breath. And I want you to slow your heart rate. And I want you to slow your mind. And I want you to put inside of yourself gratitude. To tell yourself that you're grateful. And then I would challenge you to do this, whether it's just you by yourself or you're with family members or friends. I want you to go around and share gratitude for a possibility of something good that you can imagine for your future. It'll be tempting to say that you have gratitude that someday you can go back to the way it was. No. Don't go back to the safe old wineskin. Don't go back to the torn old cloak. Allow God to take you out of your comfort zone. I'm going to try to do the same thing. Raise your glass. In celebration. God isn't done. God's grace hasn't run out. And there are new things ahead of us. And for that, friends, we have so much for which to give thanks. Amen.